Hello and welcome to Fix My City on Asake Online. My name is Leslie Moyo. In today's edition of the program, we give you highlights of the National Resident Summit, which was held here in the city of Bulawayo, which was convened by the Bulawayo Progressive Residents Association in partnership with other stakeholders. The conference was being held under the theme Rethinking WASH sector financing in the context of devolution, where the stakeholders were mainly reflecting on the implementation of devolution as contained in the country's statutes.
Been asked to talk on an overview of devolution implementation in Zimbabwe, specifically looking at dynamics of legislative, fiscal, administrative and resource mobilization, and also focus on issues of alignment of our legislation or our legislative instruments with the Constitution. And as a way of starting off our presentation, I wanted to highlight that the introduction of our Constitution in 2013 was a watershed moment, where previously we had not really known or heard issues of devolution being covered constitutionally or devolution being mandatory. So the Constitution actually made that much cried for process of devolution now a mandatory process in our governance processes. And one issue that you all agree with me is that one major reason why we were clamoring for devolution is we were more concerned about equitable resource distribution, where we were always worried, especially from this part of the country, at the riches that were flowing from Matebele land, going to Harare and never coming back to Matebele land, which is one key reason why people clamored for devolution. They wanted to actually experience the joys of what came from their localities. And in that regard, you find that Section 264 of the Constitution then specifically put in place a scenario where it was now mandatory for government to ensure that in all governance processes, local authorities, starting from the provincial councils, provincial metropolitan councils, and our municipalities and RDCs, should be given the responsibility to spearhead development processes within their areas of jurisdiction. But you'll agree with me that the objectives are set out in the Constitution, the processes that are set out in the Constitution have not been realized, have not been fulfilled, so to speak. And one thing that you'll agree with me as RAs is that local authorities are key, vital cogs in governance and service delivery. You cannot talk of service delivery minus local authorities. You cannot talk governance minus local authorities. Though many a time, because of selfish, self-centered interests within our government elites, they many a time want to sideline our local authorities because centralization is lucrative to them, because they can then, at the end of the day, actually manage to do what? To abuse resources as and when they feel like. So it is against this background that I've been asked to actually come and discuss this topic. And you will all agree with me that in as much as local authorities are central to devolution and governance, whatever they can do, whatever they can achieve, is very much dependent on the powers that they are given and the resources that they have at their disposal to actually implement effectively the powers so granted to them. So what we have here is a scenario where for our local authorities to effectively deliver what is due to us from them. Everything depends on the laws of the country. It depends on the politics of the country, and it depends on the socio-economic operating environment. And for us to understand why we are where we are, I just want to briefly look at the historical background to devolution in Zimbabwe. I know this may not be very much of an issue to most of us, but so that we can actually then all move along the same wavelength, I just thought it may be necessary. You agree with me that the history of our country is rooted in our pre-colonial history. And in the pre-colonial era, our governance systems were rooted in indigenous knowledge systems, indigenous governance systems that were inherently decentralized and community-based. You look at the pre-colonial states, Yomapungubwe, Great Zimbabwe, Mtapa, Rose, Ndebele, they were decentralized polities. Devolution was very much in practice, to the extent that localized decision-making carried the day and could be implemented for local level development. The problem only came when our pre-colonial system was usurped with the coming of our erstwhile colonizers. Where there was consensual decision-making prior to colonization, when the whites came in the 1890s, they brought with them centralization. So you find that from 1890, when our country was colonized, up to 1980, under the colonial authorities, that is when centralization gained roots. That is when centralization became the order of the day. Our country, once it came under white monopoly capital, was settler dominated, it was centralized. And most crucially for us, the whites introduced what were known as the native commissioners, Oskomich, Vanamjiti. And it is those people who truly represented centralization in our society. They usurped, they replaced the decision-making authority that was in the hands of our traditional leaders. And all local administrative authorities now was vested in these native commissioners. Legislative instruments that were introduced, like the 1930 Land Apportionment Act, the Land Tenure Act of 1969, among others, Native Land Husbandry Act 1957, all those were elements of centralization. And we have even seen them despite our so-called land reform today. The centralization brought by Land Apportionment Act is still part and parcel of our current so-called land reform process. You want the land, your documents have to go to Harare. And someone will make a decision and say, Kumalo does not deserve any land. And that's that. You will not get the land. So you'll find that the whites brought with them a system which destroyed the devolved system of governance that we had before their coming. The so-called White Councils Act of 1937, amended in 1957, created local bodies or local governance authorities in rural areas, and these were tokenistic and underfunded. The underfunding that we are complaining of today started with that act in 1937. The tokenism that was pointed out by his worship of ceremonial mayors started with that act of 1937. The act was designed more to control Africans than to actually help them develop. The same way that our Urban Councils Act and our Rural District Councils Act today are also designed to make sure that we don't develop at the local level. All development is controlled by what? By the metropole, by the so-called core, and the periphery regions don't benefit anything at all. So we are looking at a scenario where in 1980 we gained independence and continued using the instruments that were introduced by the whites. Now we have a black elite in control, using white elitist policies to subjugate their fellow blacks. Post-independence, 1980 to the 1990s, we have a scenario where the centralized system that we inherited in 1980 was not dismantled. The ruling elite instead grabbed it. And I would like to believe they actually ululated, that they found in place a system that would actually enable them to continue the same process that the whites had been doing, now using black skins. It reminds me of a book by Frantz Fanon called White Skins, Black Masks, where we have people who are in black skins, yes, but their behavior, their attitudes, their perceptions are white, colonial mentality. So we have got the Urban Councils Act of 1973, which is still in use today, amended in 1996. We have got an act introduced in 1988, the Rural District Councils Act, both giving the Minister of Local Government discretionary authority, widespread powers to control local authorities. And these powers include the authority to suspend councils and approve budgets. So you can just imagine when you operate with an axe hanging over your head at any moment, any moment, any moment, you are already operating in an environment where you are cowed into fear and submission. That's the environment in which our local authorities are operating. Because there is a superordinary being called a Minister of Local Governance, who has got discretionary powers to dismantle whatever the people on the ground can decide. I think we know in the early 2000s how many mayors were suspended willy-nilly. Thousands vote for them, one man suspends them. Your Dagamas, your Kagurabadzas, your Mutsuris and the likes. Bulawayo was the unique one where Ndabeni Ngube continued and was never suspended. All those are results of the colonial instruments that we inherited, did not dismantle, and continue to use. 1984, we see a so-called Prime Minister's Directive on Decentralization, which attempted, I will say attempted in courts, to bring development closer to provinces and districts, but real authority remained decentralized in Harare. It was a tokenistic policy. On paper, in practice, it brought nothing tangible. We see the introduction of the so-called district development committees, the provincial development committees, even going down the ward development committees, the village development committees. Very brilliant ideas on paper. But we don't see anything tangible coming to the ground. Why? Because the DDCs and the PDCs were mere extensions of central authority. The provincial administrator by then, who is now called a permanent secretary, was an extension of the Minister of Local Government. The district administrator was an extension of the Minister of Local Government, and they remain so today. That's why you are never consulted when they get appointed. They just come as political appointees. At times you may get Guzura being appointed to administer development in PPRIZ. And he cannot even say one word of defender. And he will be supposed to spearhead development there. That's the reality on the ground. You will also find that the 1980s to the 1990s was an era characterized by one-party dominance. And because of that one-party dominance, there was excessive suspicion of provincial autonomy. Yes, we had two parties up to 1987, but one party was largely on the run for reasons best known to the authorities of trying to entrench one-party hegemony. So at the end of the day, we see a state that is afraid of its citizens, so does not want to bring citizens into mainstream development discourse. 1990s, we see the introduction of ISAP, which tried to bring about liberalization, reforms, decentralization, modernize the governance, was supposed to come into the picture. And you will agree with me, that is the period when you also see an upsurge in civil society because of those liberalization processes. The World Bank and the IMF Bank, the reforms, forced the government to actually liberalize the political environment, but they still maintained a leash on activities. The Rural District Councils Act of 1988 was revised to give RDCs some developmental muscle, some developmental functions, but the key problem is that they were still supposed to depend on handouts from central government, resource dependence, which up to now is a major problem that will keep our devolution dreams to remain as dreams. Because central government keeps a tight hold on the purse and they dish trinkets as and when they feel like. You find that the 1996 amendment to the Urban Councils Act was meant or proposed the rationalization of urban and rural councils, but the political interference did not enable that. Political interference made sure that those would remain ideals and not reality. We see the fact that when the 1984 policy was implemented in conjunction with those acts, the decentralization that we see was largely administrative. The appointment of formally absent officials at the local level who did not have resources because they operated in an environment of physical delegation, where they would get resources as and when central government felt like. Then, at the turn of the century, we see the UNDP coming with what was known as the Decentralized Cooperation Program or the Decentralized Support Program. And I remember at one point an NGO was formed to actually specifically implement this. That was called the Zimbabwe Decentralized Cooperation Program, ZDCP, to try and bring to fruition strengthened local governance. But this clashed with our centralization tendencies, and it never saw the light of the day. At the turn of the century, we see clamors and calls for devolution increasing, especially now from a constitutional perspective. And we see that the contested elections of 2000, 2002, and 2008 made the heat get more and more, such that a new governance framework became an imperative. And this governance framework, it was envisaged, would actually overrule or subjugate tendencies of centralization, reduce over-centralization. And we see civil society activists and organizations, we see the opposition movement, especially the MDC, we've got the NCA and other CSOs being in the forefront. We also see a lot of heightened voices, especially from Matabeleland, increasingly pushing for either federalism or devolution as a solution to regional inequality. You'll agree with me that voices were most vocal in Zimbabwe from this region, pushing for either federalism or devolution. And we then see the GPA of 2008. And I remember September 2008, a lot of people celebrated, thinking finally, Eureka, we were reaching Canaan. Why? Because the agreement included commitments to constitutional reform. And we see COPAC getting to the ground, 2009, 2013. Extensive consultation. Some of us actively participated in that. Some of us were commissioners. Some of us were rapporteurs. Some of us joined in the consultative framework and we aired our views. And that resulted in the 2013 Constitution with a strong chapter 14 that clamored for devolution. And that's where we want to look at issues now. The Constitution through chapter 14 mandated devolution, but actual implementation has been slow and contested. Why? Because we find that a lot of issues covered in our Constitution have not been implemented on the ground. The dynamics, legislatively, we've got a scenario where local authorities have got lawmaking authority. They've got lawmaking powers. And their lawmaking powers primarily come from the Urban Councils Act, specifically Section 198, and the Road District Councils Act, specifically Section 90. They can pass bylaws, but the biggest problem is that even if they pass bylaws, whatever they decide on is subject to ministerial approval. Fana lo mntwana osefuna ukuthatha aqale etshela ubaba mbonazana sengikhulile babe ngathi awukakhuli andithi ukandawuda kurora baba wakati awusathi wakhura awurori nokuthi awusathi wakhura. That's the scenario facing our local authorities. They can propose bylaws, the minister can shoot them down. Furthermore, the Act specifically say that bylaws are subject to acts of parliament, meaning that national laws supersede bylaws. So that's a big challenge and a big problem there. You can have brilliant bylaws that you think of, and if the central authorities feel that they infringe on national laws, the bylaws cannot carry the day. On the physical dimension, Section 310, subsection 3 of the Constitution obligates central government to allocate not less than 5% of national revenues to local authorities. And like I said, they introduced the intergovernmental fiscal transfer system in 2019, but disbursements have been erratic, they've been delayed, or they've come with labels already attached to them. The mayor highlighted on the Belarus fire tenders. Those are the transfers. You are given money which you are already told what to use for. So in other words, you have not been given money. Angitsho uthuma umntwana uthi ngiyakunika pocket money kodwa uthi pocket money le ngicela uthenga ichukela uthenga isinkwa kungaba le change ubusibona ungenzani ukwasi change ayikho. That's the scenario that we are looking at there. So we have got local authorities who on paper are being given resources, but in reality the resources are tokenistic, they are not coming, they are delayed, or they come already spent. Like what the international capital does. They'll give you a loan and tell you can only spend this loan with the companies from our borders. That's what the government is doing. 400,000 per fire tender, which is inappropriate for Bulawayo. Money down the drain. And all local authorities were given those fire tenders, whether you wanted to or not. Administratively, we've got under the Constitution Section 276, subsection 1. Local authorities today have administrative independence to manage local development priorities, that is service delivery, community engagement, and planning for their activities. But central government interference once again is high. You cannot procure anything without the central government's authority. You flight tenders, PPRIZ, which is central government, is at the center. And even if you have got a tender which you think is the best, central government can tell you don't give this one, but give this one. So at the end of the day, you don't have that authority. Section 268 and 269 of the Constitution usher in provincial councils, but do we have them? 12 years after the Constitution, Chapter 14 has not been implemented. Where are we going? Revenue mobilization powers. Local authorities have got the authority and power to generate revenue through rates, service charges, business licenses, parking fees, and local levies, etc. But the big problem that comes is that even when they manage to collect that, when it is not enough and they want to borrow, they have to seek authority from central government. The local government minister has to approve or reject applications for loans. We have got a scenario, like the mayor highlighted, where local authorities used to have wide revenue bases. And the vehicle licensing was one such levy which was taken away from them. And I remember when I was growing up, even bicyclists used to pay rates. That was taken away again. Le sticker aluminium. It's also a bicycle now tell it. But that is no more. All that is revenue that local authorities had. So they now rely too much on what? On central transfers. We also had what were known as, like in Bulawayo, there was the Bulawayo Municipal Commercial Undertaking. Rana Ingwebu, the Aislip Farm. What happened to that? All those are revenue streams that were taken away from local authorities. Rufaro Marketing in Harare, Go Beer in Gweru, Pungwe Brewery in Mtare. All those were taken away. And now our beer halls have been turned into church halls. Because Zimbabwe is no longer capacitated to actually operate the way they could have done. The last part, alignment of the legislation with chapter 14. As already highlighted, our two main laws predate the Constitution. They have a lot of provisions that actually contradict the Constitution. And on that, I actually have a problem with us as RAs. Are we saying we cannot litigate against these two acts? Because they ultra virus the Constitution. Why are we not taking action? We need to actually take up arms and actually contest these laws because they are running contrary to the Constitution. And any law that is contrary to the Constitution is null and void. But we have not raised any voice against those. The two acts contradict section 274, they contradict section 276 of the Constitution. Because those two sections recognize the autonomy of authorities. But how can they be autonomous when they report to a central government minister? They are not autonomous. But we are not contesting that. I wonder why. Provincial councils are still not there. That's another issue to contest. We may not get immediate results, but when a noise is made, it has an effect one way or the other. The Devolution and Centralization Policy of 2020 provides policy direction, but it has no force of law because there is no legal instrument backing it. You can't implement the policy without laws to back it. All that because we don't have enabling acts or enabling act for chapter 14, which is the key major hindrance to the implementation of devolution. And the major reason from my perspective is that there is lack of political will to implement devolution. Even labo bantu esabathumayo eParliament laseSenate abalaso isifiso sokuthi devolution ibe khona. I've never heard any MP from Matebeleland raising noise effectively through a private member's bill or any act to show that they really want devolution. Bapis vaya kapule Harare. Sabafojela sifuna devolution but sebekapula sebekhohlwe ngathi. Bazasikhumbula ngo2028 nxa becampaign ngo2028. I will remind you, devolution will be at the forefront. So, at the end of the day, by way of conclusion, I want to say that the constitutional commitment is significant, but the practice lags behind the promise. We don't have the implementation gravitas because there is no enabling act. The mismatch between constitutional provisions and outdated statutes is the most critical hindrance to the implementation of devolution in Zimbabwe. Like I have already highlighted, there is mismatch between constitutional supremacy section 2 and sections 264 to 301 of the Constitution and our outdated legal instruments, the Urban Councils Act and the Rural District Councils Act. And without aligning the vision of the Constitution as shown in section 264, we cannot fully realize devolution. From my perspective, for us to have devolution, we require 4 key issues. Number 1, comprehensive legal reform to harmonize local government laws with the Constitution, specifically chapter 14. Number 2, we need to enhance the fiscal autonomy with the predictable disbursements and improve the accountability. But how do you account for money which you never got? Imali yahle yahambe Belarus. Yeah, but fire tender. When our fire tender engasebenziyo, so to account for devolution funds. We account njani? Number 3, there is need for capacity building to strengthen efficiency at local levels. And as RAs, we need to work closely with our local authorities. We need to capacitate them. We need to actually give them expertise. We've got a lot of people who occupy offices, but they don't know why they are occupying those offices. They don't know what they are supposed to do in those offices. Yet as RAs, we know what they should do. Let's capacitate them. Then last but not least, there is need for genuine political will, which, as I have already highlighted, is currently missing. Our political elites, our ruling elites, don't want devolution. There is no other way to describe it. They don't want devolution, because devolution will take from their cake, which they want to enjoy alone.
Thank you so much for tuning in. I do hope you gained some valuable insights when it comes to the implementation of devolution. If you have any service delivery challenges in your area, do get in touch with us, and you can follow us on our various social media platforms at site ZW. Let's meet again in the next edition of Fix My City. My name is Leslie Moyo.